Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webcast from wherever you may be tuning in around the world. My name is Nic Stone, and I'm a senior reporter with Refinitiv and Project Finance International. Today, we're going to be covering the infrastructure opportunity, measuring the impact on investment strategy. We're going to cover things from the political underpinnings and dynamics surrounding the bill, fiscal and other macroeconomic impacts on the proposals, the practical market implications of the proposals, including project delivery and finance, and the climate or sustainability dimension of the bill. In terms of housekeeping, if you're at all interested in asking a question, please use the functionality on the platform to send in your Q&A questions, and I'll hopefully be able to get to as many of them as possible. And yeah, we have an all-star cast who are ready to answer as many questions as we get to during the hour. And I'd like to get out of the way as quick as possible, but before I do, just a brief introduction on all of our panelists. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Mitchell Silk, who's an infrastructure sector veteran who recently served as Assistant Secretary for International Markets at the US Department of the Treasury, where he helped to design and lead the government's global infrastructure finance plan. He's been tapped as a senior advisor for private capital mobilization at the World Bank. We also have Andrew Olmem joining, a partner in Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. office. He recently served as the Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Deputy Director for the U.S. National Economic Council, where he oversaw the development and coordination of domestic economic policies, including for financial services, technology, telecom, energy, and infrastructure. And during his tenure at the White House last year, he also played a key role in the passage of the CARES Act for coronavirus relief. David Horner, who's a partner at Hunton Andrews Kurth, also in DC, with particular expertise in transportation and PPPs. David served as the U.S. Department of Transportation as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and Chief Counsel of the Federal Transit Administration during the W. Bush administration, and has also served as a director of the Washington, D.C. Metro System. Beth Ann Bovino is with us, the Chief U.S. Economist at S&P Global. In this position, she develops S&P's U.S. economic forecasts and authors the monthly U.S. economic forecast, the quarterly U.S. risks to the forecast, and a variety of other publications. She's also been tracking the infra bill and its impact on the U.S. economy. Sonia McMillan, who's a managing director at Amber Infrastructure in the group's investment origination team. And as a fellow Australian, I'm tipping she'll probably be the most intelligent person on the panel. But she has extensive infrastructure transaction and legal experience as a former managing director and general counsel for Rubicon Capital Advisors and a director of infrastructure at InfraRed Capital Partners after some years with Allen and Overy. And finally, Mike Parker, who's America's infrastructure leader and a senior managing director at Ernst & Young Infrastructure Advisors. He advises on developing, transforming, financing, acquiring, or divesting infrastructure. He also served as the CEO of a former company that was acquired by Ernst & Young. So at the moment, we're at a position where market enthusiasm around infrastructure is almost at fever pitch. On August 10th, we saw the first trillion-dollar bill get through the Senate, and we now are waiting on further developments of that. And I think I'd bring Andrew Olmem, who's spent a lot of time in Washington and knows a bit more about the machinations of what's going on there. So let's know where we're at the moment in terms of the bill and what the kind of what's going to be the next steps in terms of what we see coming out of Washington.
Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for having me today. And so the bill has already passed the Senate by a healthy margin, about 69 votes, and now it's sitting in the House. It's been caught up in a debate amongst congressional Democrats about which bills are going to go first, the reconciliation bill or the infrastructure bill, or how they kind of go together. And so I think right now there's expectations that ultimately the infrastructure bill will be passed by the House. It's just a question of timing. And again, that will likely over the next month or so figure out exactly how Democrats are going to move it. There is a deadline that's been somewhat agreed to in the House to bring the bill up by the 27th. But I think there's a lot of expectations that that deadline could easily be missed due to the crafting of the reconciliation bill. So it's possible we see the bill by the end of the month, but it's also possible it gets held up as the reconciliation bill moves through. But again, it's very likely we're going to see that bill passed.
And I might just keep you on, Andrew, and you might be able to tell us, I mean, how does this bill differ from previous kind of infrastructure plans, and what exactly are we looking at in terms of the bill?
Yeah, it's, the headline number is pretty large, and it's much larger than prior infrastructure bills. But if you actually start to kind of go through it, you can see that a lot of the bill is a bill is made up of a composition of other infrastructure bills that Congress has been working on for some time or as part of normal reauthorizations. For example, the surface transportation bill that Congress has to reauthorize every so many years is a big component of this, and that reauthorizes the Highway Trust Fund, for example, for another 5 years. Another thing where it's also similar, actually, is that there's a lot of expectations that we would get a much longer reauthorization as part of an infrastructure bill. And in the end, they landed on 5 years, which is about kind of average for reauthorizations of the Highway Trust Fund, for example. There are also several other bills that were put into this package, including on kind of water infrastructure. That's a bill that has been being worked on for a long time in Congress. And so if one goes through it, it's not really surprising what's in it, and there's not a lot new per se because of that. What I think is new from this package, though, is the scope of the issues that ultimately were included. Right? This bill doesn't include merely traditional infrastructure like money for highways and ports, airports, that sort of traditional infrastructure. But it also includes, substantial money for resiliency, schools, high-speed internet, so I mentioned clean water, supply chain resiliency, power infrastructure and grid resiliency, cybersecurity, wildfires, recycling. So it's a pretty broad mishmash of items that ultimately fell under the rubric of infrastructure, and that's also why the kind of price tag was as high as it was.
Thanks, and thank you. I might bring in David here. David, you've spent a lot of time in Washington as well, and I'm just curious. I mean, here then that there was, a number of new, infrastructure assets as part, explored as part of this bill from Andrew, and I was just wondering, what are the common misconceptions about the bill, and what does it do, and what does it kind of look to address?
Well, thanks for that question, Nick. Well, there's good reason to temper enthusiasm for the bill because not all of the funds that appear in the headline figures associated with various programs we read about have actually been made available for expenditure by Congress. This bill is an authorization which establishes a framework for subsequent action by Congress to make actual dollars available to the beneficiaries named in these programs. So the Congress did take the extraordinary step in this authorization bill of making approximately $90 billion of the $1.5 trillion available immediately. But Congress must take additional action in years subsequent to the enactment of this bill to ensure that funding actually flows to the intended beneficiaries. And with respect to portions of the bill that may be more controversial from a policy standpoint in the realm of U.S. partisan politics, this is important to note. In the event that there is a change in control of the House of Representatives following the elections in 2022, some of the funding noted in the headlines may actually not materialize on the ground because it's not appropriated by the party in control of Congress at the time. It's a very constructive step forward, but we need to bear in mind, I think, that the actual funding has yet to materialize.
Okay, and I did a couple of interesting points that have been raised already in terms of what is infrastructure. And I think that's one thing, obviously both parties and broadly speaking, the Republican Party seems to suggest, such as roads and bridges, more traditional ideas. Whereas with the Democrats, there's a lot of, climate-related ideas and projects, as well as kind of high-speed broadband. I was just wondering if either of you two might comment on how, particularly given your experience in Washington of late, how those, two kind of different ideas of infrastructure are kind of reconciled, in the deal-making process.
Well, I think you choose the word reconcile well, because it's in the reconciliation process proposed for the $3.5 trillion budget legislation that one of the two parties' expanded conception of infrastructure will be substantiated. This bill, the one we're discussing in this broadcast, is confined substantially to infrastructure classically understood, meaning fixed assets in the ground that enable movement of members of society and transport of goods and communications. So I think that Congress has come together around the infrastructure bill in recognition that everyone agrees, at a minimum, that infrastructure includes these programs that conform with a legacy understanding of what infrastructure really is. But the main dispute, of course, will arise in the context of the $3.5 trillion budget act to follow, in which includes sort of highly contested understandings of infrastructure. So in a way, the bill we're discussing on this broadcast is a result of a consensus around the legacy understanding of infrastructure and its respect of the human services elements of infrastructure, that there is some controversy between the parties and within each party, moreover.
And
yeah,
I think
I'd add to that, though, that I agree the dichotomy you present, there is some truth to, but it can be pushed too far. For example, you've seen Republicans support a lot of resiliency measures and funding, not only in this bill and prior bills. The broadband provisions also have some significant support amongst Republicans. So I think one has to be careful when thinking about how these bills on which party is where in a lot of these provisions, because when you get into the Senate, it gets a little bit more complicated. And as somebody who's helped craft these bills in the past, there's a lot more bipartisan support on these issues than kind of meets the eye outside of Washington. And when you sit down to put together a package, right, you have to put together a package that has 60 votes. And so when members kind of do that hard work of sitting down and figuring out what their priorities are, they usually find a little bit more grounds for agreement. And that's how these kind of packages get together. Now, for example, it's also true, like Republicans got in some important permitting reforms into this bill that a lot of Democrats didn't like. But there are some Democrats who like them. And so most of them turned out to be in this group of members who negotiated the package. So there's a fair amount, this bill did build, the members who drafted and did the hard work of crafting this bill did a good job of kind of coming together and doing the hard work of finding out exactly what issues crossed the party line so that they could get a vote of 69 senators.
Yeah, and I might bring in Beth Ann Bovino now just to kind of talk about that, because I think one of the things that is in the favor of this particular bill is the impact that it'll have on the U.S. economy in terms of jobs and many other factors. So I wonder if Beth Ann, you might just be able to run through what you're seeing on that end and some of the goals that I guess we might achieve via this bill.
Sure. So First, it's interesting what people are saying. I do think that it really is not, for years there's been the question of will government pass an infrastructure program, and it's been always, kicked down the road. And so now it seems like it's not a question of if it happens, it's a question of how big. But from my standpoint as the U.S. chief economist at S&P Global, I see, we at S&P Global see infrastructure as an investment. This investment is considered really the fuel to drive the economic engine. In other words, it's the grease that keeps the economy moving along. So some of the analysis, I was interesting to hear what my fellow panelists were saying. One of the things that we are kind of considering, particularly, I don't know if it was Andrew who mentioned it, but what was interesting is that a lot of it is traditional highways and roads, but there is a little bit more of the resiliency that's put into place, as well as some of that climate-related aspects. Some of the green that would have been surprising earlier on. But in terms of we did an analysis, we kept it we kept the numbers as basically we said about what we did was we did an assessment of what would be the impact if $1 trillion in investment in infrastructure was made in the United States over an 8-year period. It was kind of loosely driven by the bipartisan agreement, but very vaguely because the size of the package is still unclear. Overall, we found that for every dollar invested in infrastructure today over an 8-year period, it would bring back about $1.40 in economic activity for the United States. This is a short-run projection. It's over the time frame of the period. However, we find that if it's done wisely, meaning that the productivity gains from a smart investment, I was glad to hear that broadband was part of it. I'm sure many were troubled during the pandemic with that. So the productivity gains would mean more economic activity later on. I'll give you an example of, for the United States, the Eisenhower highway system that was put in place about 60 or 70 years ago. It cost about $500 in today's terms. With all the goods and people that travel on it every day, it paid for itself. They say that the multiplier, meaning that multiplier was 6, or that for every dollar spent back then, we got $6 back. I'll just do a quick assessment of the analysis the numbers that we came across. We found that today, if $1 trillion in infrastructure was invested over an 8-year period, we saw that it would again create about 1.4 trillion in economic activity over that 8-year period. That means that's about 2.5 times what the United States lost during the pandemic recession. That also means that business investment would increase by an additional 1.7 trillion over that 8-year period. Households in the United States would spend about close to 700 billion through 2030. And the productivity boost, again, if the investment was wise, would probably lift a potential, we saw it as lifting average potential growth in the United States by about 10 basis points over that 8-year period. Right now, potential growth has slowed dramatically. This is something that would be I guess, happy to see, I guess you could say, going forward. So I'll stop there and pass it back to you.
Well, that's great. I think now we might try and, focus in a little bit and get into the nitty gritty and look at some of the specific areas that the bill, kind of aids. And I think, for instance, there's been an increase to the cap on tax-exempt highway or surface freight transfer facility private activity bonds from 15 billion to 30 billion. There's been, a template for adding broadband as allowable use for private activity bonds, which have, been quite popular in financing US infrastructure in the past, as well as carbon capture improvements, the technologies to be eligible for private activity bond financing too. So I guess the question, I'd like to bring Mike in here, what particular sectors and segments of US infrastructure do you think will see the most significant positive impact from the infrastructure bill, and why?
Great. Well, and first of all, thanks on behalf of EY and myself for the chance to talk to all of you today. I think, look, we can all look at the headline numbers and see what those are. And there's almost every publication out there has different nifty graphics that allow you to sort that. And I guess those that are a little bit more sophisticated are showing the difference between continuing programs versus new marginal spending really on top of what would have been projected continuing spending. I think when you have to scratch the surface a little bit below that, because much of our infrastructure in the U.S., unlike many other countries, is funded at the state and local level, and of course also by the private sector. And so another really important question when you start thinking about what areas are going to be impacted is which types of funding are going to attract additional capital or displace capital, or at least be incremental on top of that. So I think we start to think of, first of all, in the area even where we've just got incremental spending continuing, or rather baseline spending continuing, in the current political environment that we've had and in the recent past, it's been very hard for a lot of state agencies or governments to really plan with certainty around that. And so notwithstanding some of David Horner's comments about the still lack of certainty, and one can never tie the hands fully of a future Congress, but this is a lot more clear of a marker, even around those programs that people can plan against. And even somebody like Beth Ann makes the remarks about S&P looking 8 years out. That's started. We're starting to get a longer term thinking, which is how this country used to approach traditional surface transportation infrastructure. And so I think that's very helpful. From a private sector standpoint, in transportation, those areas, sometimes the instinct is, hey, there's going to be more funding. That means less opportunity for private sector. We don't see that. When we see private sector actually being pulled in as there is stability to do projects, to do planning, to get more projects in the pipeline. Like one great example of that, we point to LA Metro or Georgia Department of Transportation, where they've got large programs that were with locally authorized new funding, $100 billion over the long term in the case of LA Metro, $11 billion in the case of Georgia and the mobility improvement program. And both of those have led to activities to really attract more private capital. So I think when you sort of step back and to come to your question, Nick, of like, well, what's hot? I think some of these new areas that we see really validation for, and where there's a lot of huge amounts of investment flowing and more will, EV fleet conversion, school bus fleet conversion, and the entire supply chains around those. We've talked a bit about resiliency before, and those are exactly how that plays out. Would be very significant and could also intersect real estate spending. Same thing for cyber and broadband. These are areas where, depending on how the programs are rolled out, there may be latent demand that's just not economic to serve now, but it doesn't mean that there isn't an ability to pay something in many parts of the country that are underserved. And so to the degree that this really attracts additional private capital, and then the knock-on effects from what we're going to see from hyperscalers, from data centers, from otherwise are there as well. Same thing on renewable power generation overall. And so I think we're very bullish both on what this means at the sort of base dollar level, but also as you unpack certain areas like that to see what the longer term impact and the amount of capital that can be attracted beyond just this funding.
Yeah, and I think the bill calls for a big increase, perhaps 10% increase in spending. And I might bring in Mitchell here just to follow up on that. Mitchell, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'm largely ad item with Mike, completely behind all of his comments. And I just wanted to drill down on a couple of the points, looking at matters from the kind of broad perspective of impacts. And I divide, when looking at the categories that are covered under the bill, I look at really two key impacts I think are relevant to the discussion. One of them is impacts on growth by sector and asset class, and the other is impacts on finance. And Mike has made some really great points on the issue of where the bill and the intended provisions are catalyzing or potentially crowding out private capital. So I wanted to drill down and give a couple of examples there. So it's pretty interesting that in the round, there's a pretty significant uplift, pretty dramatic in some areas in terms of the proposals on funding. In some cases, I would have thought that those uplifts are actually not needed, particularly in broadband. And it's particularly lacking in some other areas. And I just wanted to mention kind of the provisions on power grid and and T&D in passing. And so what I'd like to do really quickly is just, I kind of find it easy to divide the world into conventional infrastructure. A couple of our friends have talked about, conventional hard assets, roads and bridges, public transportation, rail. The other piece of it, which you've referred to, Nick, as kind of sustainable, I like to talk about in terms of transitional. I'm not going to get into the details of renewables or EV. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But one really critical element that I put into transitional is transmission and distribution, which I think really requires a little bit of attention. So in the conventional area, roads and bridges are a big winner, 110 billion. Public transportation, also a big winner, 39 billion. The interesting point there is that under previous legislation, public transportation has already been allocated 70 billion. And if you look at the numbers, that 70 billion of existing is already 15 billion more than would be required to run all of the 2,200 nationwide transit agencies in 2019 dollars. In rail, also a big winner, 66 billion, but there are some really key considerations that folks need to take into account in terms of existing operational models, economic performance, and backlog and maintenance that really need to be addressed before new money goes into new growth. My two biggest issues are in the area of broadband, and this is really one area that is a little bit concerning to me, both in terms of the quantum that's being discussed and where the money could come from, and therefore giving rise to some concern in the area of crowding out private capital. So the allocation in broadband is 65 billion. Beth Ann was spot on. It's a really, really important area. But it's interesting to look at the numbers, particularly for rural. So the FCC did a reverse auction last year. The findings of that reverse auction indicated that the price tag to remediate or address the issue was about 10 billion, very considerably less than the 65. And even more interesting than that, there were private sector companies that were prepared to step up to the plate, most notably Amazon, OneWeb, and SpaceX. So that's really one really good example of where one would have concerns about crowding out private capital, notwithstanding the great points that Mike made about all of the catalyzing of private capital effects of other provisions of the bill. The one that really, really concerns me is transmission and distribution. And the reason my blood pressure goes up here is because the capital needs prior to the boom in renewables, and particularly looking back over the rapid installation of solar and wind over the past 3 to 5 years, not to mention before that, were already extraordinarily large, and funding gaps were pretty big. Just to look at annual numbers, the annual needs for T&D in the United States are at about 63 billion. Spending annually is at about 40 billion, so there's an annual gap of about 23 billion. That's an existing gap, and that gap is exacerbated by the pressures for installation of new T&D capacity to act as bridging and accommodating all of the new renewables that are rapidly coming online. And so the 65 billion under the bill, in my view, is inadequate to meet base needs, let alone ongoing growth needs. So some great impacts and also a couple of issues of concerns. Thank you.
Because in the last 24 hours, there's the House Energy and Commerce Committee approved a portion of the $3 trillion budget reconciliation bill. And, as part of that, they included $150 billion for clean electricity performance program, $13.5 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure, $9 billion for electric transmission lines to deliver renewable energy, and up to $28 billion for a green bank. But I think I might bring in Beth Ann again quickly here. I mean, do you want to comment on that crowding in effect of the bill?
Sure. So I just caught my attention when I don't know if it was Andrew who brought it up, but Mike. Oh no, it was Mike from Ernst & Young brought it up, and then I think Mike still commented on the crowding out effect, which is very real. When you talk about the crowding out effect, the question is could a program like this infrastructure package be done deficit neutral or debt neutral? It doesn't look like it's going to be the case, and there is a crowding out effect that's in play that certainly is a concern. But there is also a crowding in effect. It's an economic story where it's basically if you build it, they will come. Imagine a better conduit in terms of infrastructure. What happens is that businesses start to form around it. Houses are built. You can see a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy on the positive side. That's one of the reasons why in our analysis we saw a big boost in business investment driven by the infrastructure analysis that we did. That's something to keep in mind, and something that actually does, over the long run, does pay itself, pay back what the investment that was put into place. Meaning that over the long run, that investment, both on the business side, because of that crowding out effect, does have a long-term gain going forward. So something to consider.
Yeah, and I might bring in Sonia in here now and kind of shift the discussion a little bit into the certain sectors and changes that we might see. And I was wondering, Sonia, if you might be able to kind of run us through how the government, keeps pace with the rapid changes and growth in certain sectors, and in terms of, new projects, what you expect to see the bill to kind of either hinder or help in terms of and growth sectors.
Sure. Thanks, Nick, and thanks for having me. Do you know, I don't know if there's going to be an immediate impact on, pipeline. And I'm sorry, I'm assuming you're talking to me from the private investment perspective, if this will sort of accelerate a pipeline for private investment. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's correct. And which particular sectors, I guess, you expect that might be benefited from this?
So I think, at the moment, it's a great thing that the bill, provides clarity on, sectors the federal government will prioritise, such as broadband, energy transition. We've talked about resiliency sectors, but these are all sectors that have been attracting, and have been attracting a lot of market interest and activity, even without the bill. So sort of, we don't really see it as having any sort of immediate impact on creating pipeline. The infra market and the broader infra market is really active and buoyant at the moment, and that sort of activity has been generated without the bill. So, to be honest, I don't really, in the short, medium term, I couldn't tell you where this money will go, how it will be accessed, how it will be allocated. And we're hopeful in the long term, of course, we think it will have a positive impact, but in the short and medium term, we think it's sort of going to have either a neutral or a potentially sort of detrimental effect on sort of traditional pipeline and procurement of P3s and what have you. But I think the market has done a really good job recognising the sort of immense infra needs to generate activities in growth areas such as the resiliency sector, storage, renewables, and what have you. So to answer your question, I don't think that, we're going to see a huge uplift in pipeline immediately.
Okay. And Mitchell, would you like to jump in there and comment on that?
Just one footnote with a little bit of data to support what Sonia said about market activity. It's just interesting to look at the quantum of private capital that has been and continues to go into domestic U.S. infra. And it's an interesting story. The headline numbers are pretty simple, but what's really interesting about it are where the numbers have trended during the pandemic. And so if we look at private infrastructure spending for 2018, 19, 20, and the first half of 21, the numbers are pretty extraordinary, humming along in 18 and 19 at just under 300 and just over 300 billion for those 2 years, 297 for 18 and 342 for 19. 2020, which, slightly counterintuitive, would have thought numbers would dip much larger than 19 at 410 billion. And we're trending based on first half 2021 numbers to exceed 2020, where we're humming away at 208 billion for the first half of 21. So those numbers would most certainly support what Sonia is saying, that the private market seems to be, I wouldn't say necessarily taking care of all of the country's issues, but certainly serving a very considerable piece of capital required in the sector. Thank you.
And Mike, do you have something to say toward that as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that. And I think like the pace of private capital fundraising focused on North America and the U.S. in particular has been torrid and stunning. Now, of course, some of that capital is also deployed into the selling and acquiring assets, and so a lot of closed-end funds will transition assets too. But we are seeing, especially whether it's in power or rail and other places, there's just a core level of investment in infrastructure that's happening that is sort of outside what some would focus on the public-private partnership market, what they would define, but which is really happening. And so areas like communications that we've talked about that certainly were accelerated during the pandemic, as have been renewables, among others. I think it is important to understand the context of the U.S. market, which is so large, and in some ways the private investment in some key sectors has been nascent, that when we see a little bit of uplift or just a handful more projects, the sort of the multiplier of that is significant, because it's times $1 billion or several $1 billion at any given moment. And so I think the market has a lot of room to grow, and we're seeing a lot of our clients really think much more broadly about the definition of infrastructure. I think we're even seeing deals like recently the acquisition of First Bus and a focus, looking ahead on bus fleet electrification. Just to pick sort of like one seemingly niche example, the quantums that will be involved and the role for the private sector in that will be very large. And so I do think that even those of us who sort of look at this narrowly, we step back and see this slightly even wider definition of what is infrastructure. The numbers are very, very significant. And I think the need for industry to tool up in a lot of cases is important too, so that some of what we're not doing is just growing cost. And I think that's one of the most important things about this being a multi-year bill, is that ability for industry to look ahead and for the economy to grow into the ability to actually deliver a lot of what's in here.
I want to move on to PPPs and the like in a minute, but I just, Beth Ann, if you might give a general take on the infrastructure credit market at the moment relative to corporates and government bonds, and kind of where we're situated at the moment.
Sure. So what we're looking at, one of the things that, first of all, the infrastructure market has been incredibly strong, particularly the ESG side of things. We've seen that's been just booming. It kind of makes sense. First of all, the yields are higher for infrastructure bonds relative than those of corporate bonds, and similarly related corporate bonds, as well as a bit higher, certainly higher than government bonds as well. Partly there's that illiquidity premium on project debt and infrastructure bonds. So that's one of the factors. But another factor is we've also seen, I don't have the exact numbers and I can look it up, but comparatively low, they also have, infrastructure bonds have comparatively lower default totals than corporate bonds, a much higher recovery rates than corporate bonds. It also gives a much greater chance to diversify into a broader investment pool. When you think about the correlation with other assets, almost everything is correlated these days, but there is a much lower correlation from infrastructure to other asset classes. So it does have there is certainly an interest, and that's why you're seeing a real boost in activity in this area.
And I imagine federal, credit support would be obviously positive for this. So, yeah, does David or want to?
Sure.
Andrew, just kind of comment on how that federal credit support.
I'd be happy to do that, and I would just just as a follow-up comment on what Beth Ann just described, it is interesting to note that major investment houses, including most recently JP Morgan, that forecast returns over the next decade across all asset classes, have designated alternative assets, including infrastructure, as the asset class that will deliver among the very highest returns available to investors on a global basis. And they note that the traditional capital markets, for example, are expected to have depressed returns. So there may be, in due course, growing or emerging retail demand for access to alternative assets, including infrastructure, that would have the effect of lowering the cost of infrastructure delivery over the next decade from sources of private capital as opposed to public funding. So that's it's quite interesting, and there are still other regulatory measures to be taken to unleash private sources of capital, notably with respect to insurance regulation. The prior administration urged the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, for example, which promulgates best practice for state regulators of vast pools of capital managed by insurance companies, to assign lower capital charges associated with investment in infrastructure. So we could see as a supplement or as a source of funding that could well supersede portions of the congressional program, capital from insurance companies and similar sources in the event that there is a wave of regulatory change at the state level, again, having the effect of lowering the cost of project delivery within the infrastructure asset class. So Beth Ann's point about the cost of capital associated with infrastructure is very well taken, and it will probably decline if you believe the forecasts of investment houses over the next decade as demand for access to these categories of investment grows.
But yeah, I think it's an interesting point. And I think
but very briefly, the infrastructure bill absolutely affirms, in the most emphatic terms, the continuing role of credit support in the delivery of infrastructure across the United States. The new bill has reauthorized TIFIA, which is the sort of workhorse of the U.S. market for surface transportation, PPPs, by authorizing or reauthorizing, extending on the basis of the TIFIA model, similar programs of credit support for water and carbon capture projects. And it has made access to programs for federal credit support for intercity rail and commuter rail easier and less expensive for applicants. So this is the good news from the standpoint of the US P3 market is that the bill appears to represent broad policy acceptance of PPPs as a bona fide tool for large-scale project delivery, because Congress is enlarging the role of federal credit support that has been market tested over the years in the P3 market in order to make the benefits of these programs more extensive than they have been in the past. So it's the role of credit support should not be overlooked when we're talking about grant funding of programs. And in fact, because these credit support programs are administered by the executive branch of the federal government, they can be, relatively speaking, more nimble than the grant funding sources, or the part of the agencies that distribute grant funding. There's a lot more to say, of course.
I just wanted to remind everyone to. Yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone as well quickly, just if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab and remind and send those questions in, and we'll try as many as we can. I just wanted to bring in Andrew here to talk perhaps a little bit about permitting. I know that's another kind of way that the federal government has been, helping the infrastructure market via this bill. Would you be able to run us through some of those issues on permitting and what kind of government support looks like there?
Yeah, this is a really important area because even though a lot of the attention, gets focused on what's actually in the bill and the kind of legislative process that creates the bill, more people should really focus on how this money is going to be implemented. In my view, it's an underlooked part about a successful infrastructure package. Even if you have healthy levels of authorization and good programs, how they're implemented is critical. And one experience I had in the administration was learning how the permitting system in the United States is really fundamentally broken. And we've had a real backlog of projects simply because the permitting process can take too long. It's taking, in some cases, 7+ years to get appropriate permitting for a highway, for example. So even, like rosy economic projections about what the bill could produce can be really undermined by how this bill is going to be implemented. Now, the bill does contain several important permitting reforms. It codifies actually a Trump-era executive order that creates one decision maker for the permitting for major projects. It also sets a deadline of 2 years for major projects to get their permitting satisfied, and a whole series of other deadlines and procedural requirements to facilitate the decision-making in infrastructure projects. Now, it's important to be clear, like on most of these reforms, they're not changing any of the substantive requirements, for example, the environmental reviews that are needed. It's just merely what they're trying to do is condense the decision-making time frame, because what we effectively have in the United States is a process that is so long that delay effectively means no. So most of these reforms that are in the bill, if implemented correctly, should allow for a faster determination of whether a project's up or down. And that overall will mean a much more efficient allocation of infrastructure resources. But again, a lot of those permitting reforms depend on implementation by the agencies. And they are reforms that agencies sometimes have done a good job implementing, and other times, in my experience, have not. So that'll be a key piece to watch going forward. And, a related area too, I just note on P3s, is that there are also additional kind of restrictions that are in the bill on some of the provisions that I think we've been discussing here that we're most optimistic about what it could do for the private sector. That I think we're still also a little concerned about from the way we analyze the bill, because, for example, in asset concession assistance, there's now provisions that any asset concession program, in order to be eligible for federal assistance, there can't be any job displacement or negative impact on persons earning less than $400,000 a year. Now, you can understand why policymakers inserted those provisions, but that will potentially, depending on how those provisions are implemented, really restrict the use of P3s going forward.
I don't see it as.
So, did you want to jump in here and comment on the?
Yeah. Well, just in the balance, if I may, Nick. I mean, in the balance, I think the bill is substantially favorable to P3s and asset monetizations, while interesting and growing in frequency, do not account for the principal part of the market that we commonly refer to as the P3 market. Yeah. And with respect to impacts on jobs, it is already the case that these deals hold affected parties substantially harmless from it. So your point's well taken that it is a restriction.
It's about how it's implemented, David, right? If there are new provisions the point I'm trying to make, right, is that it's all in the execution, and how those provisions, for example, are interpreted could be very broad or very strict. And that's where I say, like, you could have all of the other positive provisions we've been talking about for P3s, which I agree are in there. But those types of provisions are the ones that, as we look at it, we're really going to have to see how the agencies interpret, and then and what it actually means for receiving grant funding, for example. Yeah.
I wanted to start talking about environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, impacts on the bill. And I think it's interesting. In the last couple of weeks, President Biden has been kind of going touring different climate-related disaster zones, and the US it's tipped over $100 billion from climate-related fires or hurricanes. And so I was just wondering if, Sonia, maybe you'd be able to talk a little bit about how ESG kind of considerations are impacting the infrastructure market at the moment, and what that means for capital flows and for the types of projects that are coming to market.
Yeah, sure. I think the key thing for investors is that now the focus is on both financial and non-financial returns. And I think, for a developer and a responsible investor like Amber, ESG has always been an issue, and for us it's more about we just have to work harder to achieve the non-financial returns while we maintain the financial returns. But it's certainly a priority and a key issue of consideration for all global investors at the moment. And it is driving decision making about allocations and about selection.
Mike, are you seeing similar things?
Assets.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike, did you have something to add to that on the ESG side?
Yeah, so on the ESG side, look, I think from our standpoint, we have launched, just to give you a sense of if we're a signal in the market as a professional services firm with 300,000 folks, we've created a full ESG service line offering and designated here in the Americas, Orland, Boston, to lead that. And part of the reason we're doing that is that both at the LP level for investors or for private capital, as investment capital flows often from pension funds and other places into financial institutions, funds, asset managers, it's coming with increasingly sustainability environmental goals. It's also, from a performance and risk standpoint, increasingly starting to be assessed and considered. And so from a diligence standpoint, it has to be thought through. And then from a transformation standpoint, it becomes not just an imperative for existing entities, but actually a basis where asset managers can add value because they can have a path to transform pools of assets. And we see this like even in whether in the power sector or in a number of others where you think sort of downstream that this is starting to happen. And then ultimately that there will be different types of asset managers, those that specialize in transforming and changing the ESG profile of assets and moving them sort of to the top quadrant. And sort of some investors and some direct investors who really can only hold sustainable assets and will do so. And so I think whether at the largest corporate side, we're also going to see waves of divestitures of some assets that some need to be retired, but some also that could be managed separately and upgraded as well. And so I think we're seeing ESG both as a driver in the market, still a need to get to more standardization alignment on reporting, but really at every step, both from at the earliest stages of where capital comes from to the downstream measurement of its impact on our environment or from a social governance standpoint, all of these come into play. And so I think these bills emphasize and will encourage more investment into the areas that match that. And so I think anybody ignores this at their peril.
Does anyone else have anything? Mitchell, would you like to comment on that at all? On the increasing, importance of.
Yeah, I'm completely. As always, I'm completely with Mike on his observations. I thought it might be interesting just to have a look at the issue from the standpoint of a couple of the concrete proposals that are in the bill. And, the ESG considerations and the sustainability considerations of the contemplated bill are really important. And there are multiple levels of analysis on it. We begin at the starting point of really the high importance of decarbonization. Goes without being said, cuts across everything that we do in the space. I kind of see two levels of analysis that come up in the bill in this area. One is specifically targeted areas in the bill that are designed to hit at the issue of decarbonization by promoting a particular type of activity or growth. So the EV space is a great one. EV infra, there are two very large slugs, $7.5 billion for each of EV charging infrastructure and buses. But it's a little bit tricky because you know, on the busing side, very solid arguments, very good economic models that have emerged. These are fleets that go from point A to point B and have very set charging places and set routes. The issues with you know, passenger cars and particularly road charging are a little bit more challenging from the standpoint of the emerging technology and the business models. But when looking straight at the kind of ESG issues specifically, I kind of look at it at the ESG benefits of reducing emissions at the point of emission. But then I think that there's a broader story behind it, which is that if you're going to be fueling cars with electricity, the electricity has to come from somewhere. And so the carbon neutrality of the sourcing of the power that is supporting the EV charging infrastructure is something that needs to be taken into account in the round. And it's not just the power production, it's the life cost, environmental and social cost of all of that as well, relating to supply chain of the power production as well as decommissioning. So interesting and important area, really, really challenging analytically.
I just wanted to bring up a point here. I mean, it's interesting because there has been a lot of talk about electric vehicles, and there's obviously some space in the bill for them, and you know, paying for some infrastructure that related to them. But I was talking to a mechanic recently who was quite bullish on hydrogen, and instead of, you know, everyone going out and buying an electric car, he thought it would be better for most cars to be converted to burn hydrogen. And I guess the question that emerges from that is, the federal government, and how did the tune with what, you know, particularly when these technologies are changing so quickly, how do we kind of keep our finger on the pulse and address, you know, actually the needs of the day and what people in the country actually want from their infrastructure? Does anyone wanted to take that little that question?
I'll jump in if you'd like, and David Horner. Yeah, go, David.
I was just going to say, I think I haven't formed any definitive views yet, but that it'd be interesting to understand the extent to which the infrastructure bill is predicated on pre-pandemic travel patterns, user demand, commercial movements, and the like. I sense that it anticipates the formation of new communities, to some extent. For example, the support of broadband and achieving connectivity among people who are not physically proximate to each other, very important. On the other hand, I ask myself whether the bill takes sufficient account of the fact that there'll probably be, if post-pandemic patterns continue, patterns of commuting and the like continue, whether they'll continue to be the sources of revenue that traditionally have supported many of the infrastructure programs administered by the federal government, such as tolling or gas tax by way of, raised by way of vehicle movements. So it's, yeah, I mean, you raise a very good point. Transit, for example, might epitomize a misallocation, because transit systems across the United States have experienced a collapse in user demand. It's not returning with any robustness whatsoever. And yet the fiscal support from the federal government of transit properties across the United States continues, perhaps in anticipation of a return to the status quo ante pre-pandemic. But on the other hand, the transit systems may not require the level of capital that have been allocated to them in this bill going forward, for example.
And Mike, did you have something to add there?
Sure, and I know we're running up on the time moment here, but look, I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic than David, and I think that there is a reconciliation coming for many communities of where as EV vehicles and fleets sort of convert and maybe even become autonomous or semi-autonomous in some directions, and what is the definition of transit and what is the definition for certain communities and its purpose. But I would say also as an organization that is occupying our new 800,000 square feet of space at 1 Manhattan West, right behind Moynihan Station, those who bet against on the death of cities or New York City or others, do so at their own peril too. And I think the ability for talent to be in many places and to work together remotely as we're all talking to each other now versus there is great. But we do still think that there's going to be density and there's going to be excitement. There's a lot of young people who are going to be moving out of their parents' basements and back into cities and already are right now. And I think really one of the things that maybe is interesting to think about when we see this level of funding in, say, transit is how do we move to a higher utility curve for infrastructure, the same thing for power grid or otherwise, where we don't just accelerate the planned investments that were kind of needed if we're going to parse things out over 15 years, but we really look at one-time switching costs. And, if you're going to have electric buses, at some point you're going to have half your fleet ICE, half electric. How do we get transit agencies to work together to develop one garage that multiple are using? At some point, will transit agencies need to merge? Potentially so in some areas, and perhaps they should. But I think this idea that a lot of change, actually, we see in the corporate world, a transformation takes upfront capital. And we actually have that upfront capital now. And I think that's really maybe the exciting question is, can we use it not just to make the investments of before, but to make these transitional steps that are needed now. So I'm excited for it, and so I'm hopeful that in the coming months, we'll continue to make progress on our vaccination. Otherwise, and we'll see many of you in person instead of here. But I know it's going to be it's a different world no matter what.
Thanks, Mike, and yeah, hopefully next time we do this, we do it in person, and by the looks of things, we could probably set aside 8 hours or something or more to talk about this. It's obviously a very big. A lot of questions and a very big sector to cover. So there will be a recording available of this if you missed it or you want to watch us all again, go through these issues. I just wanted to thank my panelists one more time. Andrew Olmem from Mayor Brown, Mitchell Silk, formerly at US Treasury, David Horner from Hunt & Andrews Kurth, Beth Ann Bovino, S&P Global, Sonia McMillan from Amber Infrastructure, and Mike Parker from Ernst & Young. So signing out from my parents' basement, I've been Nic Stone for Refinitiv, and I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.